the possible and the virtual. If both genius and its ideas do not exist outside their material expressions, then it is no longer possible to interpret the Mannerist theory of mimesis in hylomorphic terms as saying that the content lies waiting within the marble for its cognitive form to be hewn out. The authority of Mannerist texts on art has led to precisely such an idealist interpretation. It was precisely in these Aristotelian terms that Benedetto Vacchi, a pupil of Michelangelo's, described the task of the sculptor as an inducing of form into matter, as a drawing forth of real from potential existence. Yet when he complimented his master, Signor Buonarroti, you have the brain of a Jove, Michelangelo responded, but Vulcan's hammer is required to make something come out of it. The passage from the intellectual concetto, this sort of means conceit, an inflated opinion of oneself, or vanity, or old use of a witty, fanciful, or ingenious thought or idea. And it comes by way of the word conceive, by analogy with deceive and deceit. The passage from the intellectual concetto to the hand that realizes it entails much more than just a hylomorphic passage from matter to predetermined form, because the idea of the whole composition must constantly be rehearsed in a painstaking process of experimental construction. In the words of Charles de Tolnay describing Michelangelo's Day and Night, painted 1526 to 1531, in a very real way, the primitive form of the block had a decisive influence on Michelangelo's imagination. As he became absorbed in it, the inner image awoke in him. One can actually see how in his sculptures and reliefs, he always allowed himself to be guided by the primitive form of the block, and in his frescoes by the dimension and shape of the surfaces at his disposal. More philosophically speaking, if the material work of art is not simply conceived in the image of its concept or idea, but a veritable work, this means that Mannerist imitation can no longer be interpreted in the classical terms of the real and the possible, the latter somehow resembling and limiting the former. In reality, as Bergson argues, possibility means only an absence of hindrance, which the human intellect retrospectively turns into pre-existence under the form of the idea. For the possible is only the real with the addition of an act of mind, which throws its image back into the past once it has been enacted. Only when the past no longer has an immediate interest can it appear as divided from the present, as if we are dealing with two immobile positions outside time. But this is a projection post factum, since in fact the presence endures in continuity with a virtual past that preserves itself in the indivisible movement of the creative act. It is the real which makes itself possible, and not the possible which becomes real. Aristotle himself does not define matter in nature as formless passivity, but as a privation of form. It's something there to become something. Nor does he speak of the existence of form as unchanging. Texture, matter is a presence that is late with respect to form, a sort of past present that exists in the moment of arrival of the future, but is not yet past. As soon as it is actualized in a form, this co-originality of act and power is lost. However, form is itself the product of a material movement and does not exist outside of matter. Energia is prior to dynamis. The form-taking activity is prior to the potential. To produce something is merely to test or sound the power of nature, relaunching, amplifying, and sustaining this movement that is already at work. Matter is the substratum that guarantees a continuity in movement, dividing the mobile according to an infinite mutability. In order to understand the conditions for the creative act, we therefore need an alternative to classical aesthetics, in which thought precedes expression, and by implication also to its scientific representative, art history, or the rationalized study of creative processes. It is striking that Bergson consistently illustrates his critique of possibility with examples from art before extrapolating his argument to the universe understood as global and continuous creation of unforeseeable novelty. When a musician composes a symphony, was his work possible before being real? Yes, if by this we mean that there was no insurmountable barrier to its realization. But from this completely negative sense of the word, we pass inadvertently to a positive sense. We imagine that everything which occurs could have been foreseen by any sufficiently informed mind, and that, in the form of an idea, it was thus pre-existent to its realization, an absurd conception in the case of a work of art. For from the moment that the musician has the precise and complete idea of the symphony he means to compose, his symphony is done. It is absurd to imagine that a composer would know beforehand what the work will be, because in reality, creativity knows no retrograde movement. Only intelligence does. Indeed, the more general an idea is, that is, the more possibility it contains, the emptier it is. Only in the most platitudinous classicism is the possible given alongside the real. Yet even here we do not pass from the possible to the real according to an increase in degree of perfection, since the possible is itself only the mirage of the present in the past. This is why, whereas the technique of his art and the demands of the material pertain to the artisan's knowledge about the artist's creativity, echoing Kant, we know very little. Poetic acts cannot be submitted to the reversible historical rationality of general conditions of possibility. No zeitgeist, psychosocial, or economic milieu, or technical development enables us to foresee how an active generation will make use of all the past's potential. In reality, and hence in art, by contrast, the possible is not less but more than the real. It is virtual, and this means that it requires creative thought. While we may never know an author's intentions, we don't need to be stricken by the modernist taboo on intentionality either. Bergson distinguishes human intelligence as the faculty of a posteriori remembrance from the mind or spiritual life, which is the faculty of intuition and which is historically more closely related to the Neoplatonist intelletto. To see something is not just to know it, but to unite the duration of an individual thing with that of a perceptive consciousness that contracts the interior mobility of the thing according to its own rhythm. While the I takes its legitimacy from the general idea and grasps something by solidifying it, the mind takes its legitimacy directly from the singular and unforeseeable becoming of the visible itself. The materials we have to work with, words and images for the poet, forms and colors for the painter, rhythms and harmonies for the musician, range themselves spontaneously under the idea which they express, drawn, as it were, by the charm of a superior ideality. Intuitive ideas are generated in the fantasia, the sub-rational faculty of seeing hidden intensive relationships between things that lack the generality of extended models. Yet this does not mean that they are also less real. If things exist in time as much as in space, then we also see in time as much as in space. Every intuition is a difference of tension between multiple abstract durations or tendencies, as well as their integration in a concrete vision. It enables the mind to recapitulate the forces individuated in a determinate quality in a simple thought equivalent to all the indefinite richness of form and color. Along with philosophy, Bergson assigns it the task of art to help us pass from intellection to vision. Art educates the senses and directs our attention to the things themselves by dilating our perception of the present, extending it with the presence of things in the making. It is not a matter of rising above sense experience, but of deepening it. Painting especially gives us a brilliant and vanishing vision of alien durations within and outside ourselves. That is, beyond the bleak colors of habitual human perception. Now, is it not precisely in this sense that Lomazzo defined painting as the perfezionatrice dell'intelletto? As Robert Bresson says, to have an idea is not to see what you are already thinking, but to think about what you see and to be the first to see what you see the way you see it. Accordingly, a new interpretation of disegno interno and the aesthetic idea opens up. In his essay on the life and work of Ravaisson, a painter-philosopher, Bergson distinguishes the intuition of an idea in the mind from sensory intuition. But perhaps there is another course open. This would be to extend the vision of the eye by a vision of the mind, without leaving the domain of intuition, that is, the intuition of things real, individual, and concrete, to seek an intellectual intuition beneath the sensible intuition. To do that would be to pierce by a powerful effort of mental vision the material wrapping of things and to read the formula, invisible to the eye, which their materiality unrolls and manifests. Himself deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, Bergson claims that the idea as a mental vision is simultaneously material and spiritual. It is no longer an ideal condition of possibility, but rather a material condition of reality, that is, a matter function or tendency to action. To have an idea is to move into or adhere to the poetic ground of reality itself. It is to work back from the intellectual and social plane to a point in the soul from which there springs an imperative demand for creation, an impulse, an impetus received from the very depth of things. The vision of such an imperative presence is the speculative vision par excellence, since it is an intuition of subjective genesis and not of objective fact. While this appears to confirm the received image of art as something absent-minded, however, Bergson emphasizes that to break away from practical life is not to turn one's back on it, but to enrich it. It is also the ultimate practical vision to the extent that all pre-constituted subjectivity disappears in the buzzing activity of things. The more we accustom ourselves to think and to perceive all things, sub specie durationis, the more we plunge into real duration. To perceive is to participate in spirit in the act of making, is in the uninterrupted continuity of unforeseeable novelty. An aesthetic vision is therefore not a suspension of all action, but the drawing in of other activity into the eye of an event that exhausts all means to discern the actual from the virtual, or subject from object. So what exactly is this ideal or virtual point in the soul that is intuitively present in the density of the real itself, that is, in the depths of sensation matter, or in the words of Michelangelo, still clothed in flesh, della carne ancor vestita? Long before Bergson, Leibniz invoked the analogy of veins in marble, both to describe how pleats of matter surround living beings held in mass and how innate ideas are present in the soul. This analogy substitutes that of the perfectly homogeneous and even surface of the tabula rasa, clear slate, blank slate of Locke, who held that all truths originate in the senses. But it also replaces the Cartesian opposition between the soul populated by innate ideas and the piece of wax as model for matter that is indifferent to motion and shape. Instead, it provides a new image or thought in the act. For if the soul were like an empty page, then truths would be in us in the way that the shape of Hercules is an uncarved piece of marble that is entirely neutral as to whether it takes Hercules' shape or some other. Contrast that piece of marble with one that is veined in a way that marks out the shape of Hercules rather than other shapes. This latter block would be more inclined to take that shape than the former would, and Hercules would be, in a way, innate in it, even though it would take a lot of work to expose the veins and to polish them into clarity, removing everything that prevents their being seen. This is how ideas and truths are innate in us, as inclinations, dispositions, tendencies, or natural virtualities, and not as actions, although these virtualities are always accompanied by certain actions, often insensible ones, which correspond to them.
This is an interesting philosophy in that it has some legs in vitalism as well, despite vitalism being a sort of contended area of philosophy that seems to resurface from time to time. It's done it at least twice in the past, where we think we've done away with the vitalism, but then it kind of isn't. It's a little bit like democracy in that sense, where whether it exists or doesn't exist, there are like varying degrees to which we reify it. But the idea that the soul of an artwork or the nature of a thing exists in the physical body is very interesting in the sense that I wonder how applicable this is to people's theorizing today, in the sense that we don't really interact with a lot of bodies anymore, and the soul of a thing is a lot more ephemeral to us. very much in the sense with interacting with facets of technology like computers and screens and the internet and all these things. There's not really a body to point towards, and yet we know that something functions beneath it. I wonder how much more ephemeral people's sense of subject is, or the people's sense of artistry is, where instead of there being, say, a statue made of marble that is physically in front of you, and it's only that one statue that you're looking at any point between it just being a block of marble and the point after an artist has carved it out and it's made a different statue, and they're speaking as if they've saved this statue from its clay tomb. Whereas now, when we say look at pieces of art, we're just seeing representations of their art, and then there's no body to plunge into, so to speak.
I'm just thinking about what the moral implications of this concept would be.
I just thought of the point where he says the subject and object become fused together again. And I see that as the primitive phase of art, where there is no subject-object split. And we were recently just talking about Clement Greenberg's ideas of art, about abstract expressionism, and how in the idea of suprematist art, the idea is about the pure idea of the artist free of all external restraints and rules of the art before, and then that turns into this abstract expressionism where the actual act of painting, the artist's encounter with the canvas, is the idea. And some of the artists, like Jackson Pollock, would actually kind of dance or go into a sort of trance where they were purely in the creative act with interacting with the canvas. In that, you could see it as primitive in that there's no subject-object split. It's a pure thing again. And then as it goes on, Rothko and the others, they start to try and bring depth into the art and rationalize it. And then others try and use paint as sculpture on the canvas. So they create an actual three-dimensional outwards, like it is a paint sculpture on a piece of canvas, while others then try to bring in depth in other ways. So they move away and they rationalize and separate again subject and object in that second phase. And then that becomes common. And then again, there's a new return.
The conversation earlier in the chapter, when he says if a musician seeks to compose a symphony, if he's got everything in place, he's got the idea in his head, he's got all the musicians around him, all the instruments to do it, his symphony isn't just done by having an idea of what he means to compose, because the creative impulse isn't fully predeterminate. Van Tunen says, in reality, creativity knows no retrograde movement, only intelligence does. And I quite like that as well, because it reminds me of an argument that one of Whitehead's students presented, because Whitehead was still a theologist as well as
perhaps.
A deist would be a good way to put it. And he basically had this conception of a fully omniscient God, essentially, that could still be fully compatible with a panpsychist view of the world or his kind of process philosophy. And one of his students, I think his name was Charles Hartshorne, had an argument against this idea of a being that was fully omniscient. And he gave the example, actually, of the creative act of an artist, for example, where he said, even though an artist may have a blank canvas in front of him and a palette full of paints, God might possibly understand what art is. God may have a conception of every single potential hue of color that can be created by mixing the different admixtures of paints. God might understand. You put the paint on the thing and then the creative work is done at the end of it. But Charles Hartshorne's argument was even God could not understand, or even God could not know preemptively what work would be produced. Otherwise, creativity or the creative act itself would not function or flourish, because if it were predetermined, it feels like there's something lost from it. He had a stronger argument than what I've just summarized, but that was essentially it.
How could you square that with the new scientific thinking coming out where people are saying that there is actually no free will? Because that's kind of the same argument as it doesn't really matter what the artist creates if there isn't actually free will. And the other side of the coin is that God doesn't know what's going to be created.
I think it depends on who you believe is behind the motor that drives us. Like if there's this idea that actually all of our actions are determinate the second before we do them, as you could make the argument, there's already a disconnect between the present moment for ourselves and action in the first place, because it probably is possible that you can tell a second before anything happens within the body, there's always that trigger. And then this reminds me a little bit of Sapolsky's biology or neurobiology, where he looks at, say, what happens in the mind of X person who does Y before they do it. And then you look a second before and see the state of the brain. And then you go a minute before, and then maybe a day before, and then a year before. And you can make some relations and correlation that way, a very wide, grand scheme. But what I would say is it depends on who you think's behind the motor. There's a difference between if you think there's no free will because God wills it versus there's no free will, but there's also no one behind that reflexive impulse to just do what your body will be doing without you being there anyway. It might result in the same thing materially if there's no free will from the new scientist position or from the omniscient God position. But I think that the idea of feeling driven, I completely respect the idea of feeling driven. I feel driven all the day, but it depends on who you think's behind the wheel, I suppose.
The God thing, I'd say it's purely incidental to God knowing what art is going to be produced. It's the other side of the coin that is more interesting, that there is no free will. So then what is the creative act?
Maybe it's that the notion of unmitigated free will doesn't exist, but the notion that everything is automated also doesn't exist. So then between the two, you have restricted will. So given a certain set of circumstances, you can make a certain set of choices, and you're not as free as you'd want to be, but you're also not completely inept to follow one mode.
I completely agree with that, because you do have a limited free will, but it is based on the exigencies of your position at any given time and your situation, where you live, and your class.
Thinking of it as a sociologist, I always just think of that one line. Everyone's got free will. The rich and the poor alike have the freedom to sleep under a bridge.
It's an interesting question. And the thing is, with more and more science, biology that is discovered, more or less makes the position that everything is more or less determined by biology and so on stronger. And on the other hand, there are a lot of people that work against that for obvious reasons. In art, it's one of the most radical ways in which to discuss this problem.
I know what you're talking about. I think it was 2 years ago, an article came out that said that there may in fact be a gene that makes people violent. And it's interesting because you could look at it in one light as, oh, this is a gene that makes people violent. Violent people don't really have any willpower over their actions, so you should be sympathetic. Or there's the fascist route that goes, violent people have inferior genes, and liberal genocidal rhetoric that'll arise from that. So I've always been hesitant with any scientific studies that come out that claim we have found genetic components that explain violent behavior, because it reminds me of that notion about cultural hegemony.
The thing is, the evidence slowly but surely stacks up. And it's much more than just genetics. The living situation of your mother influences the development of a unborn child in an epigenetic way. And living standard and so on. These are all, at least to some extent, influencing our disposition.
It's a combination of nature and nurture, environment and all the other things.
The thing is, to claim that your violent behavior is somewhat not your fault because it was determined by genes or whatever. Nobody from a scientific point of view saying that. It's just that some people have the tendencies to do such and such things. But this is true with other things as well, like how you're raised and so on. But I would view it from an existentialist point of view, like it's something that makes decision making harder to some capacity, but that is no reason to act against rationality. So you definitely can combine it. I get where you're coming from, definitely. I would just also be hesitant to completely negate biology in this way.
Yeah, but in that claim that you mentioned earlier, a horrible living condition can influence people at the epigenetic level, then you start falling into that whole chicken or egg situation where you go, And to be honest, in that claim, it's leaning towards the social circumstance. But when you start getting into these conversations outside of the popular science article, it starts getting really confusing which one actually comes first. And they seem to be almost inextricably tied, which is also why I hesitate for the genetic articles a bit, that I see pushed more than the social articles.
It is obviously one thing, and it's clear that you can't separate these different aspects because your stand in society, your wealth, and so on, it is one thing. It's meaningless to try to find different explanations for these things and view them as completely separated.
In general, I am a little suspicious of drawing truth from genetic destiny, as it were, because I think we've replaced one impulse with another when we look towards science to give all the answers in two senses. When we didn't have answers in pre-industrial societies, we were told to scry the stars and look towards God and to find our meaning amongst those. And the scientific impulse is internalizing, where instead Rust scry inside ourselves and look deeper and deeper still and scry in a different way. And I don't know how much genes are supposed to tell us, in the sense where I just think about the Human Genome Project, which started in 1989 or maybe 1992, but it took a whole decade, and finally the project was completed in 2001. It was completed faster than expected and under budget. And that's when we got the whole chimera produced of the human creature, the whole genetic map, which is supposedly telling us everything. But what we got was a bunch of letters repeating in all kinds of ways. And scientists were genuinely expecting to cure cancer within months after finding this all out. And instead, all we've had 25 or so years later, we haven't really been able to capitalize on these dreams that we had with this data. And so it's evident that there's more than just knowing, and there's more knowing to be done.
Of course. The level of complexity is almost not understandable. As we established, it's not enough to just know the genetic code, the whole field of epigenetics and so on. It's so enormously
I'd also
complicated.
say the material conditions alter the genome. An example is the Hunger Winter in the Netherlands, where people were starving. Their children were shorter than they were in the generations before.
Yes.
The material conditions can alter the genome.
They do it all the time. It's just
Yeah.
a question of how severe these alterations are, or if they are measurable in
Mhm.
some way.
I found this quote earlier as well, which I may have shared before, but I think you guys might enjoy. It feels in line with this conversation. Isn't it strange the way the wind makes inanimate objects move? Doesn't it look odd when things which are usually lifeless suddenly start fluttering? I remember I looked out once onto an empty square, watching huge scraps of paper whirling angrily round, chasing one another as if they'd sworn to kill the others. And I couldn't feel the wind at all since I was standing inside. A moment later, they seemed to have calmed down, but then a moment after that, they were seized once more with an insane fury that raced all over the square in a mindless rage. They crowded into a corner, and then they scattered again until some new madness overcame them, until finally they disappeared around the corner. There was just one thick newspaper that couldn't keep up with the rest. It lay there on the coals, full of spite, flapping spasmodically, as if it were grasping for breath. As I watched, I was filled with an ominous foreboding. What if, after all, we living beings were nothing more than such scraps of paper? Could there also be a similar unseeable, unfathomable wind blowing us from place to place, determining our actions, while we simply believe we are driven by our own free will? What if the life within us were nothing more than some mysterious whirlwind, the wind of which it says in the Bible, "Thou hearest the wind, and hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whither it cometh, and whither it goeth"? Do we not sometimes dream we have plunged our hands into deep water and caught silvery fish, when all that has happened is that our hands have been caught in a cold draw?
That brought to mind the quote by Thornton Wilder from The Bridge of San Luis Rey. Some say that we shall never know, and that to the gods we are like the flies that the boys kill on a summer's day. And some say to the contrary, that the very sparrows do not lose a feather It has not been brushed away by the finger of God.
That's very nice as well.
There was one other thing too that came to mind in this discussion of genetics, social causes, mix of both, which was the same time around 2 years ago when I saw that article claiming that they found a violence gene. Shortly afterwards, the Psychiatric Association started completely distancing themselves from the chemical imbalance theory, which, from my experience with therapists, they totally did believe in and wholeheartedly espouse. If you went in with anything that could be explained through chemical imbalance, whether it was depression, ADHD, they would say, you have a chemical imbalance, here's medication for it. And then a study comes out saying this is largely unfounded, this chemical difference that we've been claiming exists. And then all of a sudden, every therapist is like, we've never said that. So that's another reason why I have a personal experience of being collectively gaslit by the Psychiatric Association in America.
Same thing in England. I had the same thing told to me when I was younger.
Do you support genetic testing for gun ownership in the United States? Just ban the people with the violent genes from having guns, right?
I am
It's
very
just
suspicious against genetics because any of those genetic things, I guarantee it's going to inevitably get tied up into race. And then they're going to say black people have more of the violence gene than white people. And then they will effectively start banning guns for black people. I'm not pro gun banning.
Yeah, that's one of the issues that came to me when I was researching something for an essay and reading about genetics. And one of the issues that struck me was how there's always this discussion, how do we implement technologies that we invent? And again, it comes in line with this conversation about free will. Do we have enough free will that we get to choose how we use technologies? Or do technologies dictate to us how they will be used? And an example of this would be prenatal screening, where when it's first invented, we're like, how wonderful, we get to get a glimpse into a baby before they're born, and then this will arm people with information to make informed choices. And it's all upside. Maybe everyone should get prenatal screening. But the social attitudes that came out after that, there was a study done in Germany in the late 90s or the early 2000s surrounding attitudes about prenatal screening. And as it became more and more popular, more and more women were shamed if they didn't get screening done, and it became a political conversation. And in fact, there was a far-right politician who was talking about how every woman should get screened and you shouldn't abort babies with genetic deformities because Germany is an amazing country and we will socially provide for your children. And so women started to see other women as selfish if they didn't get screening done. And so there's a big element of shame surrounding these technologies sometimes that are unintended. And then obviously we understand what happened with China's one-child policy, which was just a side effect of this technology being widely available. And in this sense, it's a lot more difficult to tell how much more freedoms or information we get given when a technology is produced, and we can't really always account for these sort of side effects of it.
Like what was said previously as well, technology makes having a free will harder. You know, my stance on transhumanism. It's not a development that should be emphasized.
Even discussions about thinking powers or creative powers of, say, large language models. The risk with system zero thinking, as it's been theorized, is that you outsource your thinking or you outsource this creativity. And I actually saw a study earlier today even on this, which was on material scientists who were using large language models in their process to discover new properties of materials. And there were two bits of the study that really stuck with me. The first bit of the study was that it didn't seem to touch the productivity of the poorest third of material scientists. They didn't seem to get any benefit out of incorporating AI into their process. And the top third of scientists saw their productivity double. So there was already a socioeconomic element to how AI can be implemented, which I thought was interesting. But the second thing that also was interesting was across all the scientists who were using AI basically to create new hypotheses, the initial stage of R&D, then the scientists would go and confirm or deny. Across all of the scientists, they found that they were less engaged at work, or they were less fulfilled by their work because they weren't doing the fun part of it, which was ruminating and creating hypotheses themselves, and they were just doing the legwork. I found
goes
both of those things
into
interesting.
Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolution, where basically they're working backwards to the rule, and once they find too many discrepancies that don't apply, then a new theory will be needed.
Very much how a lot of Einstein's work wasn't really proven until after his death because he was working purely theoretically. You'd be like, with our current technology, we can't tell if this exists. But if it did work like this, here's how it would work. And then 40 years later, we figure out that this random thing he calculated to do with pulsar stars falling closer and closer to each other, it turns out his rate at which they fall together is pretty consistent. Another win for Einstein. But in this case, Einstein's just doing purely theoretical work, and that purely theoretical work is soon to be outsourced. All of that side of things is under some strain.
And on a very personal level as well, essentially, what is it that creates meaning for humans, for human existence? In my observation, it is to a large degree based on the work that we do in a positive way. And the more we source out, the more we will lose the reasons to actually do something in the first place. And at least I do need to do something to find meaning.
Yeah, there are tasks that I don't mind using things for. I use Google Maps when I'm in an unfamiliar place, and I find that useful. But I imagine there will be other things in the future that these systems can do that I'm pretty sure I'll probably opt for them against my better judgment because they'll be there and other people can use them.
Well, it's already like, for example, if you're writing a paper and you let ChatGPT or another do all your research for you, and if it could do that, it could also write your thesis. Doing research, it's repetitive, is potentially boring, it takes ages.
But it's also where the work happens. It's informative.
But it's not only that, it's also where the meaning of what you're doing happens. It's the collecting of ideas, the combination of ideas, the finding new ideas that build upon other ones. That is the thing that you are trying to do. And if you source that out to an LLM or to another person or whatever, then you'll not only do something that you didn't actually do, but you're also losing the meaning. And I see that in high school, it was especially prevalent, but obviously students use it as well for things they shouldn't use it for. And it frightens me, honestly.
No, I understand where you're coming from.
Should we read the last 2 pages real quick?
Yeah, by all means.
All right. Again, we must be wary of idealist interpretations. Ideas are not transcendental but virtual forces, since they are no more general than the multiplicity which they actualize. Leibniz was inspired by the silver miners of the Harz Mountains, specialists of the veins and fossils in the body of the earth, in regular exchange with whom he designed wind machines and wrote his treatise on geology and natural history, the Protégea 1691-93. Some physical interaction always corresponds to each little glimmering in the dark depths of each soul, such that soul and body are only different aspects or functions of form and functions of matter, immanent to a single and same psychophysical continuum. This continuum is like the moving depth of chiaroscuro, a background noise structured by distinct but obscure signs that subsist when the clear but confused images change. The signs constitute the propensity of things, their disposition to be unfolded in a certain way, as if they were already independently accomplishing what the artist wants and for which the latter requires only minimal force. At the same time, it does not follow that these signs resemble or signify their actualization in the end product. If they did, they would be possibles separate from their creative activation. They would not be inclinations and dispositions, but fully developed models. In truth, marble, like every composite substance, is incomplete. Its inchoate forms always tend towards realization in material processes themselves, and are therefore always between minimum and maximum states. Their essence itself does not appear at the outset, but only over the course of their development, when its strength is assured. We do not intuit our ideas as ready-made and neither is there anything natural or concrete about them. To invent is to find, erfinden, but perfecting nature means to find in it what has never been found. In other words, generative ideas, as opposed to general ideas, are the seeds of eternity that do not exist outside of an infinite and continuous movement of development and variation. We arrive at form rather than starting with it. Combining structure and genesis, memory and variation, Deleuze writes that the development of ideas is essentially a problem-solving process, not a process of modeling. Ideas are not constructions of intellectual thought, but effective encounters that make us think. The virtual possesses the reality of a task to be done or a problem to be solved. It is the problem which orientates, conditions, and engenders solutions, but these do not resemble the conditions of the problem. This is a clear reference to the problem of the distance between a lump of clay on the sculptor's bench and the mode of existence of the virtual work to be made as set up by Soriano. The virtual is a conditioned conditioning dependent upon a fragment of reality, which is foreign to its own being, and which is like its evocatory formula. Every concretely existing material, no matter how poor in modes of existence, contains the signs of a spiritual power of existence that urges its making as an instaurative actualization. But whereas the classicist imagines himself to be completely in control of his technique and materials, immediately making the work pass from power to action, the Mannerist finds himself carried away by the work to be done into a sur-existential state. He is more like an existential mechanologist who, between the initial material and final form, knows himself to be implicated among the forces that condition the work's realization, but without knowing what is required of him, except that these forces must be put in relation to one another. In fact, the responsibility for the composition, and thus for the correspondence between material and statue, is all the more anxiety-inducing when the original idea loses its authority, because everything then depends on what you will do next. The work to be done presents itself in the sobering mode of a riddle of which the solution is entirely immanent to the manner in which it is solved here and now. Work it out, or thou shalt be devoured. What is at stake in theories of Disegno is precisely this drama of the imagination, in which an obscure intuition gets clarified in a percept or a concept. Or, as Deleuze and Guattari formulate it, there is an auto-positing of the work as a resemblance or block of sensations independent of the implied subjectivities of artist, spectator, and model, such that it is difficult to say where in fact the material ends and sensation begins. All art is participatory art, since the work and its public are co-originary instance of a possible world that contaminates everything associated with it. Artists do not just create effects in their work, they give them to use, making us become with them as we get drawn into the compound. At the same time, instauration is not just a question of art, but of the material reality of sensation in general. Soriano's aesthetic paradigm is irreducible to artworks and concerns the work of existence itself, the experiment with and experience of a situation which we do not have a choice of refusing or accepting. Dasein is design. All design is co-design. Design is less a subjective decision than the ensemble of variably conditioned processes that populate a plane of composition relative to which the presence and autonomy of existence conferred upon a certain being become incontestable. Moreover, it is less an intellectual process than the active-passive mode of engagement with the fervor required of what is always this work. As a verb, the thinking of the intellect interlegere, to read, connect, between, together, is involved in the felt process of drawing together and tighter. What non-classical art merely brings to the fore is the indeterminate and oscillatory nature of this work, that is, its secondary or epiphenomenal threshold condition which prevents us from saying, this is art. If all of existence is an art, Mannerism is an art in the second degree as it exposes the disparate virtual conditions that co-catalyze in its own coming about.